Let's dive in here. All right, so before we get started, recording the slides will be shared with you after the session. This session is approved for 1.0 CFRE credits. And submit any questions you have in the Q&A at the end. We'll send around recording and slides. Do me a favor. At some point, I promise you at least a dozen people are going to ask if we're sending the slides around after we are. Please just tell them in the chat. That will save me some challenges. Also, happy Wednesday. This is the agenda, but we don't normally do this on a Wednesday. So in the spirit of things bringing me joy, my co-founder Jenny and I got to go speak at Stanford University yesterday, and so that's why we couldn't do it on Tuesday. There was a whole case about FreeWill, a business school case. Some of you that have MBAs or are familiar with the case concept, I'll do this, and so that was really fun, and to sort of go teach the students there about what we've learned along the way. So that was really special. Also, other thing happening on Wednesdays, which I was looking at it about 10 minutes ago, and I wanted to share with you all because I think it's just a brilliant idea. It wasn't my idea, but I think we saw this on like Instagram or Twitter or something, probably Instagram. And there's this sort of concept called Wednesday waffles. I don't know if anyone has ever done this, but basically a group of friends that I have on Wednesday, we don't get to see each other. We live around the country. We don't talk every week. And so on Wednesday over WhatsApp or iMessage, people record like a 2-minute video that's just like, hey, here's what's going on in my life. It's very short. It's asynchronous because we would never all get on the phone together. And it's a joy. And so I just 10 minutes ago, got to watch the first few waffles that came in on Wednesdays. Lauren says she does this with her bestie that moved away. Let me know if anyone else does it, but it's honestly just like such a joy on a weekly basis and makes me feel much more connected with like extremely little coordination or input time. So it's you might be on your phone anyway, and you get to go watch, what your friends are up to and record it. And it's very cool. Brittany says she used to use Marco Polo, or maybe still does. Why is it called waffles? I have no idea. Gemma says she does it. If anyone knows the etymology of waffles, I honestly just think it's a word that also starts with W, and so that's why it got called that. So waffles doesn't mean anything. It's just like, well, it's like it means this very specific chat on Wednesdays about your life. So go check that on. Brittany says waffle on means talk. It's a British term for chit-chatting. That is so interesting because I think we heard it from an Australian. And Kate says your friends did it, started doing it a few weeks ago. Okay, so pitch your friends on this. Let me know next week or even the following week because there's no Wednesdays between now and the next webinar how it went. So hopefully that helps out. Also, by the way, some of you got before I get into this, the morning briefing we started doing on Monday. Which is if you haven't gotten this, just shoot me an email. We'll sign you up for it. But on Mondays, because there's so much happening in the world, we're just recording like a 2-minute video that's just very, very quick and informal of the biggest news stories that pertain to nonprofit fundraising and how it might shape your strategy. And so, this week we covered what's happening in the markets, what's happening with inflation, what's happening in the administration, a couple other things. And so if you're interested in that, I have to say it was a little bit inspired by Wednesday Waffle. So if you got that, and Elizabeth says she loved it. I appreciate you, Elizabeth. If you hated it, please let me know also. Always trying to add more value. Okay, so we'll go through introductions because I've been talking too much. My name is Patrick. This is Jenny. We got to hang out yesterday. It was very special. We are the co-founders of FreeWill, which is the biggest estate planning and biggest plan giving solution in the United States, trusted by almost 2,000 nonprofits, including many of you. If that's you, thank you so much. If it's not you, we still love you a lot. So know that. And we're lucky to be blessed with that enormous, wonderful, loving team. More than $11 billion raised for charity. Again, same number of partners, probably more than 5 centuries of combined fundraising experience at this point. So that's what's going on. Last thing before we get rolling is, as a ongoing sign of how much we love you, we are going to send a copy of this book by Dan Harris to 20 people as a gift. 10% Happier, How I Tamed the Voice in My Head, Reduced Stress Without Losing My Edge, and Found Self-Help That Actually Works. It's a really fun book to read. It also has a lot of really practical things to make your life a little bit better. And so check that out. I also found out recently that Dan's kids go to school in Chappaqua with my friends' kids. And so they hang out and they're friends. So Evelina says, great book. But you are on Chappaqua, keep an eye out in the coffee shops of Chappaqua for Dan Harris and tell him you like the book. Mallory says, is there a list of all the books we mentioned somewhere? No, but it's a great idea. And I think we're thinking about doing it. So So again, if you're interested in the book, you have to drop your name in the survey at the end of the chat and not now, just to save everyone from revealing their addresses in the chat. Okay, how are we doing today? People are feeling less anxious than last week, although still a bit of anxiety here. A little bit less happy, a lot of other stuff going on, but good to see that's coming down. People are feeling less bullish about hitting their goals, which is actually surprising because there's a lot of positive economic news. And so obviously, federal funding's in the lurch. We'll talk about that in a moment. But generally, I'm actually more bullish than I think you are on this. And so we'll talk about why in a moment. All right, so let's just recap this sort of craziness that's been happening for a month. We'll go through this quickly because you know this, and so then we'll get to what to actually do about it. But some real big updates here. Last Tuesday, February 11th, so 8 days ago, the First Circuit Court of Appeals in Boston unanimously rejected the Trump administration's request to reinstate the federal funding freeze, siding instead with a lower court in the great state of Rhode Island. The lawsuit was filed by Democratic attorneys general. Always proud of us for getting that plural right. The attorneys general challenges the administration's attempt to pause grant and aid funding, with courts continuing to scrutinize executive power. So you have this ongoing legal challenge. On foreign aid, some of you have international foreign aid work that you're doing. Last Friday, so about 5 days ago, a federal judge ruled that the Trump administration must reverse its stop order work on foreign aid programs, which is basically just putting things to a halt, restoring funding for hundreds of international NGOs and contractors. A restraining order prevents the admin from placing thousands of staff on leave, citing security and operational risks. And while these yes can resume, there's obviously a ton of limbo here as things will potentially move eventually to the Supreme Court for a really important hearings and cases. So where are we? Well, some programs are still facing bureaucratic hurdles in accessing their expected funding. Policy experts predict continued legal disputes over executive authority in federal grant allocations. And obviously, nonprofits must remain vigilant for future regulatory changes, funding fluctuations, et cetera. We will do our best to keep you up to date there. So if you, obviously in this, and then in much shorter form on Mondays as well. So what's going on? There was also this one other recent executive order that we just wanted to chat about. Honestly, this just felt a little bit haphazard. So an executive order was on the 6th. The latest EO directs federal agencies. This is not technically the latest EO, but it relevant to nonprofits. The latest EO directed federal agencies to reassess NGO funding, meaning from the federal government, that undermine the security, prosperity, and safety of the American people, and directs heads of agencies to align future funding decisions with the interests of the United States, et cetera, et cetera. The new EO will likely target climate change initiatives, public health programs, international aid, immigrant and refugee assistance, DEI initiatives, and environmental justice, unfortunately. And scrutiny over foreign assistance to international programs is increasing. Agencies now have broad discretion in granting or withholding funds. This has been true for a while. And so we'll see what this looks like. There's also some chatter about IRS involvement, increasing audits, but there's some new legislation that's likely to be shot down in the House about increasing here. But nonprofits that rely on federal grants may face some disruptions and new compliance hurdles. But also, as this all sort of scrambles, and we'll talk more about this in a moment, there will be some new funding opportunities that are available soon that require rapid action and that may be really big opportunities for you all. NGOs working in humanitarian aid, policy advocacy, climate action are most at risk, and organizations may need to adjust strategies to diversify funding sources. For many people, this will be a crisis. For many people, this will also be an opportunity and a chance to really do a lot of great work, not just in terms of programmatic work, but in terms of fundraising work. So we're going to walk through some options there. But before I get to that, I mean, all eyes are on the federal funding freeze. A thing that I'm really keeping my eye on is tax policy as relevant budget bills move from between the House and the Senate. And there's a whole bunch of different negotiations underway. And that's something that I'm keeping an eye on because I'm a nerd and I really care about how policy affects nonprofit fundraising. So what are we staying on top of? The state of federal funding, the extension or changes to the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, and SALT deduction cap adjustments. What the heck are those? We'll talk about those in a second. The nerdiest thing that actually really matters today. Also, here's a cute puppy in a hammock in case that's going to make tax policy a little more interesting for you. As I mentioned, we will track changes and be providing extra sessions and resources as things develop. And we always try to do our best to break this down into simple terms. A lot of the stuff isn't that complicated. It just sounds really wonky. So we're going to help out here. So what is this Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, the TCJA? Look, this is just a fancy way of saying tax legislation that was passed the last time Trump got elected and the last time Republicans had the House and the Senate. Now, it's expected to expire, or it's legislatively scheduled to expire in 2025. And we should expect that it will be extended in some form, likely another 7 to 8 years. Another tax bill in the House, the Fair Tax Act of 2025, is potentially to take its place. It proposes to replace the current income tax system with a national sales tax of 23%, eliminate income taxes, et cetera, et cetera. This is not going to happen. So this is just sort of some posturing here, but it would eliminate a whole bunch of things. It also terminates the national sales tax if the 16th Amendment is not repealed within 7 years. So this is just something that's a little bit more theater, unlikely to happen. But what really matters is diving deeply for a moment on this Tax Cuts and Jobs Act that was passed last time, because it gives us a sense of what will happen this time. So it doubled the standard tax deduction, and it capped the itemized deductions for state and local taxes to $10,000 a year, right? So this is state and is the A here, local taxes. That's where we talk about SALT. SALT taxes is redundant because the T is already taxes, but it's SALT, right? So that's when you hear about SALT in the news, that's what that is. It also capped the mortgage interest deduction. For mortgages taken out after December 15th of 17, interest is deductible up to $750,000 and 375 folks for married filing separately. So 750 is for a married couple filing jointly. And as I mentioned, these are set to expire on December 31st of this year, but extending it is a major focus of Republican lawmakers. So why does this all matter to giving? It's actually not that complicated. The reason is that most taxpayers get bigger tax breaks from taking standard deductions, which means not adding all this stuff up, just saying, yeah, standard deduction, than they do from itemizing charitable deductions like mortgages, like SALT. But really, what we're talking about here is charitable contributions, right? So that really matters as well. So keep that in mind there. The result is that 10% of Americans now itemize deductions, down from 30% pre-Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. Okay. A study by Indiana University and Notre Dame found that charitable giving fell by $16 billion annually in the TCJA's first year of implementation, because fundamentally, again, it's not that complicated. Charitable giving gets more expensive when you don't get a tax break for doing it. It actually just costs you more to give $100 if you don't get some portion of that back in tax rebates, right? It's just basically legislative inflation for charitable giving. You can see this in the study from Notre Dame, but among households that have previously been itemizing but switched to taking the standard deduction 2018, the amount they gave to charity decreased by an average of $900, right? So this matters. Tax policy matters. Incentives matter. This really affects things. You can see here, right, in this top 1%, you can see what percentage of taxpayers itemize deductions. In the top 1%, yeah, those folks are still itemizing, right? 95 to 99, we're still itemizing too. 90 to 95th percentile, now only 40% of us itemize. 80 to 90th, down to 25%. Fourth quintile, which means basically 75th to 80, only 15% of those folks are itemizing, et cetera, right? So you end up with folks who are just actually getting more, charitable giving is getting more expensive for them, and so they're doing less of it, right? It's very simple supply and demand. When things get more expensive, people, for the most part, do less of it. And so that's a big deal. What am I watching? What am I keeping an eye on? What am I reading about so that you don't have to? One is understanding the tax policy promises that President Trump made in the 2024 race around tax policy. What was included here? A lot of stuff. No taxes on overtime, no taxes on tips, no taxes on Social Security, ending this cap on SALT deductions, which is really important for a bunch of higher tax states, as well as extending tax breaks for the wealthy. But if you add all these up, they cost a lot of money. And there's a bunch of House Republicans who do like tax cuts, but hate deficits. And so at some point, if it increases the deficit by too much, and there's a threshold here, thinking about $1 trillion a year, which is quite a lot of money. Maybe it's two. I'd have to double check on that. But then these deficit hawks are going to say, nope, we're not voting for it. And so what's happening is the folks that are pro-tax cut and the folks that don't want to cut other programs and don't want to explode the deficit, well, these are all trade-offs to be made. So let's come back to SALT, right? Now we know that there's this sort of deficit hawks in the more conservative wing of the Republican Party, but there's also a bipartisan SALT caucus, which sounds like a fun team to be a part of. It's made up of Republicans and Democrats in higher tax states. So there are plenty of Republican members of the House from California, from New York, from New Jersey, potentially some others. And those folks say, this SALT cap, where if you live in New Jersey and you're paying X amount in income tax, well, you can only deduct 10,000 of that from your federal taxes. And it would be much better if you could deduct 30,000 or 20,000 or whatever it may be. And so these New Jersey Republicans, these California Republicans, these New York Democrats are all teaming up together. And they say, look, if we don't change the SALT cap, we're not voting for this. Now, one of the things to note here is that the House Republican majority is so thin that even a couple of Republicans walking away will sink a bill. Now, I don't need you to feel sorry for Speaker Johnson, right? But this is a hard job trying to stitch all this together because Democrats are all likely to vote no. And so we're going to see. But if the SALT deduction cap, currently 10K, is increased, or better yet, eliminated like it used to be, it will mean more itemizers, especially in higher tax states and in localities with higher property taxes, which will mean more people will get tax breaks for charitable giving in these areas. This is good. And by this is good, I mean this is good for charitable giving. You can make your own judgments as to whether or not this is good tax policy. But everything we know about economics means that this is going to increase charitable giving in these areas. So if you are a charity in California, in New York, in New Jersey, in Massachusetts, even in a high property tax state or a high property tax area like Miami, for instance, that doesn't have state income tax, you're sort of rooting for this, at least professionally, because this is going to make more people in your area itemize deductions, and it's going to make charitable giving cheaper for those folks. So there you go. Two other quick notes, right? So two other things that we're keeping an eye on, and it's really helped sort of shape the context of everything on top of federal policy changes. So one is the S&P and the Dow Jones and the NASDAQ are all trading near or at all-time highs after strong gains in recent months. This means high net worth donors are feeling well off. You might be like, man, it's rough to be an international aid organization right now, but it's not feeling rough to be a high net worth donor. Money in donor advised funds is invested for the most part in mutual funds. And so what that means is when this money is just hanging out before it gets given, it grows or shrinks as the market grows or shrinks. And so that DAF that had $100,000 in it yesterday could have $102,000 in it today. And so there's actually more money in donor advised funds. There's also more money in IRA accounts. Now, why does that matter for charitable giving? Well, these qualified charitable distributions, which are gifts out of an IRA only for donors over 70. Some of you know this really well and have made a lot of great fundraising success on QCDs, qualified charitable distributions. Now, you know that this IRA is getting bigger. What does it also mean is that someone who expected to take X amount out of an IRA has to take a required minimum distribution once you get to be a certain age, and that's bigger than they budgeted for. And so now it's more appealing to give some of that to charity because it's all pre-tax money, right? So lots of really good things. Jeffrey Close says QCDs are very powerful planning tools. And Jeffrey, I could not agree more. Evelyn says, Patrick, where would you say we are in the economic cycle right now? I've gotten different answers from different financial advisors. Look, Evelina, none of us can predict the market, right? So we could be halfway up a long slope. We could be at the very top of the mountain. We're not licensed to give financial advice, but also anyone that's telling you exactly where they are in the economic cycle is mostly lying to themselves or lying to you in particular, potentially both. Donors are also going to have higher capital gains tax liabilities because stock is growing. And so a lot of them are going to say, oh, I actually like to give a stock gift. Otherwise, I'm going to be paying a lot of taxes on that. Also, this is understated. When we talk, a lot of people say, oh, it's boom times. So let's talk to big donors. Private foundations have also invested their assets in many different things, but including the stock market. And so private foundations now have more assets than expected. And many of you know this, but private foundations are legally obligated to give out at least 5% of their endowment every year. And so that 5% of what is the big question. And if the market's doing really well, they're more likely to give out even more. So private foundations, but this means family foundations, corporate foundations, et cetera, we just don't mean federal funding. So big year for private and foundational grant funding, as well as big year for stock gifts, big year for IRAs, big year for QCDs, big year for major gifts, big question as to small donors based on tax policy. Although we will note everything we're talking about in tax policy takes place next year. Nothing gets sort of like backwards viewed to the beginning of 2025. And so we still think it's going to be a bad year for small dollar donors and a good year for major donors, right? So make sure that your strategies and where you're putting emphasis really meets that. All right, I'm going to keep going because we got a lot to talk about. January inflation was higher than expected. So a CPI report, the Consumer Price Index, I think, showed an annual inflation at 3%. This is higher than what we thought it was going to be at 2%, surprised many analysts. Now that's actually, 3 and 2 is a much bigger difference than it sounds like. It was the worst month for inflation since this is January 2023, but I think that's a typo on my part. I think it's actually August 2023. So don't quote me on this. This is likely to delay a reduction in federal interest rates. That's the bad news here, because what does it mean? It means working class donors feel less well off. Inflation bites. Cash donations lose their purchasing power for you because prices are still going up. Risk of increased expenses for nonprofits. And when we think about this rise in interest rates or sort of the lack of falling of interest rates means that things like paying for cars and paying for buildings gets more expensive because when we borrow money, it's more expensive to borrow money. This is great. Brandy says she is a lovely donor who gives stocks in January and not in the end of the year. Not sure why that works best for him, but he's done it 2 years running. So great, Brandy. So very good work. All right. So let's talk about what to do with all of this, right? So there's a lot going on. The worst thing we want to do is just freeze, right? No pun intended on the funding freeze, but we have to keep moving forward. And I'm going to sort of give you a little bit of a philosophy of how we should think about this, or at least how I think about it, and if I were in your shoes, I would think about it. And then we'll talk about some extremely practical steps. So keep on keeping on, but also be ready to pounce. And we have this adorable puma, mountain lion. Maybe those are the same thing? I'm not sure. Let's call it a mountain lion. It's a cougar. Sarah says cougar. Thanks, Sarah. And then Melissa said it's the same thing, which I think might be true. So if someone can get us some real details on that, that would be great. So many of the core fundraising practices that you're already doing, keep doing it, right? Don't try to sort of change everything and switch it up, and you're sort of ultimately going to end up in a worse place than if you did nothing different. We're stewarding major donors. We're communicating transparently with them about where we are. We're leveraging non-cash gifts. I mean, I can't talk enough about the academic research that shows this is what drives actual fundraising success. We're looking forward towards transformative planned gifts. We'll talk more about that. But the math shows that you're likely to get more planned gifts this year than any year before, at least as an industry, not necessarily each individual organization. And we also know that new opportunities are likely to appear. They're likely to appear suddenly, and they're often going to require a rapid response, right? So we're sort of doing our best existing work, and we're in a ready position to get new funding when it comes available, right? So really what it is. And John, thank you so much. John says, cougars, mountain lions, pumas, and panthers are all the same animal. So there's one more thing you learned today, and I learned as well. All right. So setting the context here, government funding has been allocated by Congress, must actually get spent. This is thanks to a 1974 law passed by Congress when they were mad at Richard Nixon. It's called the ICA, and it's really called the Impoundment Control Act. But the administration does have some discretion about how to spend it. That's left to agencies. So many funds currently being slowed will be unleashed. Many think March, right? So think about March and April and May as really big funding release times, but they could take a different shape. They could also have short deadlines for applications, right? You're going to have less. There may be some staff laid off at some of these places, and so maybe they're getting reviewed either slower or faster. My guess is that they're probably using AI to help review some of these when they do come in. So that's a big shift. And then as federal funding priorities become more clear, private foundations then adjust their strategies to fill the gaps. This is what's happened historically when there's been less federal funding. Again, this could be shorter than usual deadlines. And then what's going to happen is major donors may shift their strategies as well, right? So all of these things are happening. We need to be ready for each to happen before they happen. So you want to be ready. And even better, you want to be first, right? I mean, the first applicant on a new funding proposal is really going to get a full read. Those of you that do a lot of hiring know that whatever resume comes in first, you read the whole thing. And then, 3 days later, you realize, oh, I've got 100. And so really being early on in this process can be quite useful. Smaller organizations could have an advantage here. So a lot of smaller organizations are saying, well, we're not the Red Cross, we're not the Nature Conservancy. Obviously, those organizations do great work, but there is strength in nimbleness when there's this much change. And so you as an organization can say, okay, great, we're a more fluid organization. We have a really small team. We're just going to get in a room and figure it out. And so we're going to have a plan in place. And here's a little bit of what the plan might look like. So thing one, right? If you get government funding or if you aspire to get government funding, which is not going to be everybody, be ready. It's not the end of federal funding. We're in a holding pattern. Be ready to apply for new opportunities once the pause is lifted. Excuse me. Keep an eye on grants.gov and agency announcements. You want to set up Google alerts on funding agencies that you depend on. We have a new tool called Discover, which is part of Grant Assistant, that is constantly using AI to search every available new opportunity. But there's also other tools that you might be comfortable with to constantly hunt, but you want to be in this vigilant state. And so you're not just finding out about opportunities a month after they get posted. We're using tech and AI to monitor new funding opportunities. And so what we'll do is as new trends emerge, we'll say, we've seen private foundations move in this direction. We've seen government move in this direction. We'll be able to bring that to you. So we're on top of that as well. As we're ready to be responding quickly, it doesn't mean just sort of get stressed, right? What it means is have some rapid response team, even if that's just one person, who are involved in the grant writing and review process. Have boilerplate language for common grant requirements at the ready. So what is our organizational history? What are the bios of our key staff? What is our program methodology? What are evaluation frameworks? Things that will be required of almost any grant, making sure we have those in one place, easily accessible. That will be key. So that's on institutional funding and on federal funding. Step 3, major donors are in this place where they are ready to listen. They're invested in the work you're doing. They want to understand what's going on. So continue to message your major donors about the funding freeze, including what strategies you're taking. Being transparent is very helpful here. It's an opportunity for deep connection to your donors and for deeper connection by them to your mission, right? So it's a really key moment. When things are changing, it's an opportunity for other things to change or improve. And so don't miss this opportunity to strengthen relationships with your major donors. If you are a highly affected organization, check in on your donors. Empathy in crisis goes a long way, right? The last thing they're expecting is for you to call checking on them, but it can be quite useful, right? Be transparent about the challenges facing your nonprofit. Talk about what you might shift and get specific about any programs that are at risk and the larger implications of that, right? Many people will feel like they want to do something in this moment. A couple of talking points to use. You might reach out and say, no, this is really important to you. And that's why I wanted to share how we've adopted our youth mentoring program to serve X more students despite the funding challenges. You might say, I'm sure you're watching the news. Despite some setbacks, we've found creative ways to keep our food bank operating at full capacity, and I thought you'd want to know about them. If you're interested in how to help, then you can actually start talking about donor advised funds or other things like that. If money that's being set aside in donor advised funds, it's a really good time to ask for it. Remember, more than 250 billion, potentially much more based on market activity, is sitting us here waiting for charitable giving. We've drafted for you, I'm not going to read it in the interest of time, but we've drafted for you emails that you can send to your board and emails that you can send to your major donors, right? And these are templates. Obviously, they need to be adjusted to your organization, but we've made it as clear and easy as possible. These will be in the slides when we send them around after the session, right? So you can just copy and paste them and obviously make them your own in a helpful way here. Step 4, do not forget about planned giving. So planned giving rarely feels urgent. It's actually the most predictable funding source. We know this because of demographic trends. There's an enormously bullish outlook on planned giving in 2025, and assets that people have are only going up, right? So you'll see larger gifts between now and 2045, which is the next 20 years. The largest transfer of wealth in human history is taking place, and this will be an estimated $84 trillion. This is the opportunity to build an endowment. This is the opportunity to build sustaining funding for your organization so that you don't get whiplash when things change in the outside world. Boomers are entering their prime estate planning years. The oldest boomers are approaching 80. The youngest boomers are at retirement age, 1964, which makes them 61, I guess. You have that 19-year route. And this, if you think about small dollar donors decreasing, this will be the largest source of giving among small dollar donors over the next 10 years. And as a small note, when someone includes you in their estate plan, annual giving, meaning immediate giving, goes up by about 75%. So this can be quite useful. Step 5, we are the folks who are doing this full time, meaning FreeWill, but also you all, right? We're thinking about giving, we're thinking about giving strategy, we're thinking about how the outside world and legislative changes and policy changes and economic changes all affect charitable giving. Your donors are not doing that. And so we can reasonably expect tax policy to change this year. This could look like an extension of current policy, something else more extreme, less extreme. Be ready for these changes so you're able to explain to donors how this will impact their preferred way of giving. Be ready to help donors pivot to things like donor advised funds or stock giving, et cetera. But there's a lot of value in being the person who educates donors. One thing we love here is what we call the permanent giving guide. The permanent giving guide is a letter that explains the benefits of non-cash giving. It is designed to be kept for a long time. That's why it's called permanent. And let them know that the guide is useful for any of your giving, not just giving to your organization, right? So any of the giving across the board. You can build it for free. We have an AI tool that helps build a text version of this. Partners, you have access to a different tool that gives you the fully designed version. But giving this to major donors and saying, I know you're thinking about not just us, but other folks, take a look at this. And then every time they think about giving, they're going to think about your organization. This is like a low effort, extremely high return way to steward and support your major donors in this time. And we expect it to be quite helpful. All right. So just a little bit of talking points if you're giving this out. You say, as we face increased funding uncertainty, please use this giving guide as a reference to help org, continuing mission, or another part of this, or any other causes you support, right? This idea of like, you're just trying to help the donor in all of their strategy is actually going to bring you a lot more returns across the board. Melissa, I just want to shout out Melissa for helping me out with folks asking about slides afterwards. Thank you, Melissa. I really appreciate you. All right, second bonus step. Here's another thing that we've been working on really hard, because I know a lot of folks are saying, okay, I actually don't know how diversified I am compared to other organizations and how this works. So what we did is we built a free tool to help. And it's actually incredibly data and sort of tech intensive, but we wanted to get it out to you. I'm going to show it to you in a moment. We're going to send it to you after the webinar. All you need is your EIN and maybe your NTE code. So it's something we call the Funder Mix Insights tool. Again, it's super free. There's 3 steps. 1 is you put your EIN to get started. 2 is you receive a custom report, including a benchmark analysis of similar organizations. And 3, you can email your custom report to yourself and then share it with your team. So what does this look like? Meredith says, what is NTE? NTE, I actually don't even know what NTE stands for. Someone else can help me out here. NTE is, thank you, Phoebe, National Taxonomy of Exempt Entities. It's basically a code for different types of nonprofits. So you might be a museum, you might be an agricultural nonprofit, et cetera, et cetera. So we're going to try this on the fly. This could go terribly wrong. But if somebody knows or has access to their EIN, put it in the chat and we will use it. Okay, Pam, great speed. Pam wins. Oh my gosh, now everyone's putting it in. All right, Pam, if you can also tell us what your charity is, I'm going to put this in to make sure. Oops, that's not it. Pam, you are 273611614. All right, so we're hitting enter here. We're looking it up. All right, so we're going to assume that you entered it correctly, and you are the Arcadia Food Corporation, um, Ag Food Security. Pam, are you in Maine? If so, oh, that's Acadia. Never mind, I messed that up. Great, 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 great. Okay, so now we're doing this. She's in Virginia. So Pam, thank you so much. Pam's in Virginia. And so Pam, based on your NTE code, we recognize that you are code K20. There are 142 similar organizations with revenue ranging from 1 to 5 million. So that's who you are. Maybe this is wrong, but tell us if it's wrong. And then what we're doing here is it's basically ingested an enormous number of 990 data from the IRS. So that's where this is. So some of these things like who's getting stock gifts, that doesn't actually show up in the 990s. And so everything we have access to will be in this tool to give you a sense of this. So you can check this out. You basically say, okay, on average, you get less from federated campaigns, you get less from related org contributions, and you get less from membership dues. But you do get more government grants, you get more fundraising events, and you get more other contributions. So now we go down and say, okay, great. Well, what does that mean? Well, federated campaigns, you see the average is quite low. So we're going to forget about that. Only $317. Other contributions, you actually get a lot more. You get a million point oh eight, and other organizations like you get 676,000 on average. Great work. Wow, your fundraising events are killing it. 103,000 a year. The population average here is only 42,000. And on government grants, you're also doing better. Membership dues, average is 12,000. You don't have a membership program. And so you might want to go back and look and say, wow, other food banks have membership programs. What does that look like? How do we think about that? And then related orgs contribution, this is a little bit more wonky. We'll skip this because you don't have any of those, but about 30,000. So then we look at it and say, okay, great. Let's interpret the results here. Fundraising events, you're higher, you're lower. Also, by the way, federated campaigns on average represent about 0%. Other contributions represent about 34% in your peer group. Fundraising events only average 2%, right? And you're doing a lot better. Government grants, you get 556. This is 17.5% of revenue in your peer group. Membership dues, again, very small. Related orgs, very small. So, hey, you're doing great. You can obviously, our marketing team throws this in there and we love them for that. And you can email this to yourself, and then I think it will PDF it. I'm not totally sure. And then you can share it with your team. Be like, hey, we're doing great on these aspects. So we will email you that link. We're not going to sit here and do another 100 of them, but hopefully that's useful. We just want to help you be smarter all the time. And I think it's very hard for people to sort of understand where we are against our peer group. So hopefully that's a big asset to you. Let us know if you use it and if you like it or if you hate it. All right, so let's keep going here. Let me just walk through what I think the biggest takeaway here. This is going back to a little bit more sort of like philosophical how to think about this. But look, this is a moment of a lot of change. There's no getting around it, and not for everybody, right? So you might be running a house of worship and think, I don't get any federal funding. None of this matters to me. You're doing fine, right? But for some folks, this is a moment of big upheaval. It can often be a moment of enormous opportunity. Donors are more engaged. Institutions are thinking about it. The federal government funding opportunities may exist for you that didn't previously. We are confident that your organization can thrive during this period, and staying on offense is a really key component, right? So your nonprofit should be opportunistic in its goal to be an enormous force for good and not just playing defense here. We are here to support you. We are doing all of our homework. We are staying on every twist and turn in the news. We, as you can tell, are dreaming up new ways to help. Please let us know other ways that you think could be helpful to the whole industry. Always trying to help. We know this is a really challenging time. It honestly can be a really scary time for some folks, and it could be not scary at all for others. So just naming that as we go forward. A couple of things I want to close out. One is my colleague Phoebe is going to drop a survey in the chat. Thank you. And so please, if you're interested in the book by Mr. Dan Harris of Chappaqua, New York, please make a note here. If everyone loves it, we'll see if we can actually get him on on the webinar at some point. Make a note in the survey if you'd like it. Also, please give us your address so we can send it to you. Sometimes people don't put their address in, and that is not at all helpful. We cannot give you the book if you don't do it. Second of all, that Funder Mix Insight tool that I showed you, shout out to my friend and colleague Murtaza, who built that. Tons of work, obviously, just ingesting like millions of columns and rows of data. Amazing stuff. Thank you, Murti. So that will be there. You can share it with your whole organization. Tomorrow, because it's Wednesday, tomorrow at noon Eastern, so 23 hours from right now, we are going to do a demo for folks who are interested in increasing their institutional funding and even increasing their federal funding. So there's a tool called Grant Assistant that we've teamed up with. We are obsessed with it. It is close to magic. And the core value here is that it uses AI to help you write grants in an incredibly reduced amount of time so you can actually apply to a lot more. And in a new way, it uses AI to help you find the best possible grants for you. So this is like, it's really game changing for anyone that thinks about foundation funding, government funding, corporate funding. I wanted to give you a very quick sneak peek because I know not everyone's gonna be able to make it, but we'd love for you to do it. So basically, this is like the 8th slide in what I'll show you. Once you put in a whole bunch of information about the organization, the funding opportunity, a bunch of other context, it will actually draft the whole grant for you, and then you can edit it from there. It's really, it's just extremely impressive. Everyone that shows it just says, wow, this is the coolest technology I've seen in years in the nonprofit space. And then newly, what you can see here is it actually ranks based on your organization from 1 to 6,000 or whatever, the grants that you are most likely to win if you apply for. Now, obviously, some of these grants you're never going to get because they're for Massachusetts and you're in Rhode Island. But it will give you the most likely avenues. It will help you track it. You can collaborate with your teammates. It's honestly just like stunning, and would love to see you there tomorrow. I know it's sort of last minute, but if you can make it or someone from your team can make it, we think you'll find it fascinating, exciting. It'll probably be a half an hour, pretty informal. It's none of this sort of like endless filter work. You just sort of type in and say, hey, this is great, but like find me more stuff that has to do with nature and food and not just food. And then it sort of resource it into everything else. So very, very cool. All right. We've added a survey to the chat. We're going to spend a few minutes on questions. Paul says, we're exploring Grant Assistant and we haven't found anything better. So the webinar, that session, by the way, is tomorrow. And you should be able to sign up in the survey for that. So please do that as well. Okay, next Tuesday, excuse me. So 6 days from now, there's a lot going on. At noon Eastern, we are going to do a session on some simple steps to optimize your nonprofit website for online giving in 2025. So before we get into crazy busy season, or before we get into like reunion season for colleges and high schools, before we get into sort of Easter, Passover, Lent, everything else, for houses of worship, before we get into Eid, we are going to do a session on 5 ways to optimize your nonprofit website so you can actually make some very small tweaks that are likely to have very big outcomes. And so we would love to have you there. So please join us if you can. Feel free to send other folks from your team. Feel free to bring other folks from your team. But this should be a great session. We're already hard at work at it. And a big shout out to the whole team that's working on this as well. So with that, we're going to answer a couple of questions. We're going to end a little bit early and give you all a little bit of time back. And let's see. So what are some great questions here? Oh, this is a great question. John says, how do you communicate if your donors are in favor of the current political changes? I think unless you have a very liberal donor base, sort of more monolithically liberal, which, some of you do, and certainly some of you have monolithically conservative organizations. You really want to say like, it's not an angry email. It's like, hey, what we're seeing here is federal funding may be withdrawn, and that creates this challenge, right? And so you don't, it's not an advocacy email. Some of you will be doing advocacy emails, and those are very different. You just say, look, here are the facts, and here's what we're doing about it. And this sort of just the facts man presentation of it will go a long way. So it's not, so give that a shot. Now, some of you are going to want to rile up your donor base about that, and that's totally fine. That's just a different strategy. And knowing your audience is very, very key here. Um, this is super interesting. So Laura says, can you share tips on how to best manage the Great Wealth Transfer? Would it be helpful to organizations to invite donors to free webinars around wealth management? Many of them will be inheriting cash, et cetera. So this is a really good question. Um, what happens sometimes is this happens less now, but um, donors or organizations would say, "Hey, Patrick, we love the webinars. Would you mind coming to do a webinar for our donors? We think they'd really love it." And it turns out that donors don't want to come to webinars. They just don't. Um, it's sort of not it's not part of their workday, and so they just feel what it is. And even large organizations tend to get um, very small attendance on these things. Now, the way you get a little bit more attendance if you were doing like a briefing in this moment, right? So you might think about this is I know not your question, but you might think about, hey, we're pulling together, 10-minute briefing or a 15-minute briefing or half-hour briefing with some policy experts on the implications here and how you might want to help. Right. I think I've been getting a lot of great emails from partners in health doing this right now, and they're obviously, going through a lot of stuff with international aid freeze. And so that's an element where you might want to use it. But for the most part, something like a 3-minute video from your executive director, something like the permanent giving guide for folks that do have more asset-based giving, that could be quite useful. We obviously recommend we do a lot of planned giving. What we have found works out best is giving people free resources to do their estate planning, and in those resources, nudging charitable giving to your organization. People forget how big bequests are. People that don't do planned giving all the time forget that you might get $800,000 gifts from a middle class donor. I mean, it's so different than other types of giving. These gifts are so large. So really good questions as well. Um, sorry, I was going to say anon, but this is an anonymous question. I'm a young fundraising professional and I'm interested in deepening my knowledge around planned giving. Are there any text resources or certificates that you recommend to explore this further? So actually, if you go to our webinars page, we have every webinar posted there since March of 2020. So we're coming up on 5 years of it, which is crazy to think about. But there is a lot of stuff on planned giving. I would recommend watching that. We're also considering, we have some really special courses that we give to our partners and certificates, and we're thinking about, is there some version of that we can make more broadly available because, planned giving and smart giving are so important to the sector. And I think it's honestly just the case that if I was a development director and I was hiring somebody into my fundraising team, I would want to see three things. I would want to see planned giving expertise. I would want to see expertise in these sort of smart gifts, right? Stock, DAFs, et cetera. And I would want to see that they have some comfort with AI to really amplify the work that they do. That's what I would look at as an employer. And so as an employee, as a future employee and someone, even if you're not switching jobs, you just want to grow in your current job, I would think about those three skills as a way to do that as well. Christy says, happy anniversary. So that's just the anniversary of the webinar. We've been around for, coming up on 9 years in September. So that's been fun. All right. So let's see. Other questions. Is there any hope remaining that DAFs will be pressured or required by the federal government to make larger or quicker distributions? I would not count on federal pressure. I will say that DAF payout rates are much higher than private foundation rates, much higher, like 5 times higher. And so rather than pressure DAF holders, go ask DAF holders and give them a clear reason why to give and a clear avenue to give through your DAF, right? So these are people that care about your organization. A lot of your donors already have DAFs. Go ask for it, right? Don't get a $50 cash gift from someone who could have given you a $50,000 DAF gift. And these are really important. So you're not trying to strong arm your donors. You're trying to present them with a clear case about why them giving you money will lead to the kind of impact they want, right? So that's that. All right, let's pause there. Huge thank you to everyone who joined. Huge thank you for all the work you're doing. Would love to see you tomorrow. So please join. Big shout out to Phoebe, my colleague who helped put this together, Kara, my colleague who helped here, and Murky, who put together that funder mix analyzer, which I'm sure a lot of you will leave this call and go use. And whole FreeWill team's really been showing up. So just a big thank you there, and talk to you all soon.